She had nothing left but a letter from a dead woman and a piece of land no one wanted. When the county told her the property was just a frozen lake surrounded by mud, she almost threw the papers away. But that spring, when the ice finally melted and the water began to drain through a crack she had never noticed, what lay beneath the surface changed everything she thought she knew about loss, about worth, and about the grandmother she had never been allowed to meet. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city you are watching from. Clara Dun Moore had learned to measure her life not in milestones, but in what she had managed to survive since the last one. There were no celebrations to mark the passage of time, only small, quiet acknowledgments that she had made it through another week without the lights being shut off, another month without falling behind on the one bill that mattered most, the rent on a 2-bedroom apartment that smelled of mildew no matter how many times she scrubbed the walls. The building sat on the eastern edge of a town that had once been prosperous and now carried the look of something half-remembered, its storefronts fading, its sidewalks cracked in patterns that no one bothered to repair. She had moved there 3 years earlier, not because it offered opportunity, but because it was the only place where the deposit had been low enough to pay without borrowing. The apartment was small in a way that made everything feel temporary. The kitchen opened directly into the living room, separated by a counter so narrow that 2 plates could not sit side by side. The hallway that led to the bedrooms was barely wide enough to pass through without brushing both walls, and the bathroom door stuck unless you lifted it slightly while turning the handle, a trick her daughter had mastered before she turned 5. The furniture was mismatched and worn, gathered over time from thrift stores and curb finds, each piece carrying the invisible history of someone else's discarded life. Clara did not mind the aesthetics. She minded the draft that crept under the front door every winter and the way the heating vent in her daughter's room rattled so loudly that the child had learned to sleep with a pillow over her ear. Her daughter's name was Lily, and she was the reason Clara got out of bed on mornings when the weight of everything pressed so hard it felt physical. Lily was 7, small for her age, with dark eyes that noticed more than a child should have to notice. She did not complain about the apartment or the secondhand clothes or the meals that repeated themselves week after week, because the ingredients were what Clara could afford. She had inherited her mother's silence in the face of difficulty, a trait that should have been comforting but instead made Clara ache with a guilt she could never quite name. A child should not have to be brave at 7. A child should not know the sound her mother made when she sat alone at the kitchen table after bedtime, adding numbers that never balanced. Clara worked 2 jobs, neither of which paid enough on its own to justify the exhaustion they demanded. In the mornings, she cleaned rooms at a motel on the highway, a place that catered to truckers and traveling salesmen, and occasionally families whose cars had broken down at the wrong time. The work was physical and repetitive, stripping beds, scrubbing bathrooms, vacuuming carpets that held stains no machine could lift. She moved through the rooms with a speed born of necessity, her body memorizing the layout so completely that she could work in near darkness when the overhead bulbs burned out and no one replaced them. The manager was a woman named Deb who spoke in clipped sentences and counted towels the way other people counted money. She was not cruel, but she was not kind either, and Clara had learned not to expect warmth from a place that sold it by the hour. In the afternoons, she drove to a warehouse on the other side of town where she packed online orders into boxes for shipping. The building was vast and cold, lit by fluorescent tubes that buzzed at a frequency just low enough to become a headache by the end of a shift. She stood at a long table with other women who rarely spoke, their hands moving in identical rhythms, folding, taping, labeling. The pay was slightly better than the motel, but the hours were less predictable, and there were weeks when shifts were cut without warning, leaving gaps in her income that rippled forward into the next month's bills like stones dropped into still water. Between the 2 jobs, she picked Lily up from school, helped with homework at the kitchen counter, and cooked dinners that she stretched as far as imagination allowed. Rice appeared in every meal because it was cheap and filling. Vegetables came from cans when fresh ones were too expensive, and meat was a weekend luxury that Lily looked forward to with a quiet anticipation that broke Clara's heart every time she saw it. She had tried to hide the severity of their situation from her daughter. But children are perceptive in ways that adults forget, and Lily had stopped asking for things long before Clara had stopped wishing she could provide them. The letter arrived on a Tuesday in February, slipped through the mail slot with the usual collection of bills and flyers that Clara sorted with the mechanical efficiency of someone who knew which envelopes to open and which to set aside for later, when later meant when she could bear to look at the numbers. This envelope was different. It was heavier than a bill, made of a thick cream-colored paper that felt expensive against her fingertips. The return address was a law firm she had never heard of, located in a town she had never visited, 3 states away. She opened it standing up, leaning against the counter with her coat still on because the apartment was cold and she had not yet turned on the heat. The letter was formal and precise, written in the careful language of someone accustomed to delivering news that required legal scaffolding. It informed her that a woman named Miriam Elspeth Kovac had died on December 14th, and that Clara Dun Moore had been named as the sole beneficiary of her estate. The estate consisted of a parcel of land in rural Minnesota, approximately 40 acres, described in the accompanying documents as largely comprising a glacial lake and its surrounding shore. There were conditions attached to the inheritance, requirements for inspection and acceptance, deadlines that had already begun to tick. Clara read the letter twice, then a third time, searching for the part that would explain why a dead woman she had never met had left her anything at all. The name meant nothing to her at first. She turned it over in her mind the way she might examine an unfamiliar object found on the street, looking for some point of recognition. It was only when she unfolded the second page, a copy of the will's relevant section, that she found the connection buried in a clause that referred to familial descent. Miriam Elspeth Kovac was identified as the maternal grandmother of Clara Dun Moore, a relationship Clara had been told did not exist. She sat down then, not because the revelation demanded it, but because her legs made the decision for her. Her mother had died when Clara was 19, quietly and without ceremony, in a hospital room that smelled of disinfectant and resignation. In all the years before that, her mother had spoken of her own parents only in the vaguest terms, describing them as gone in a way that could have meant dead or distant or simply erased. Clara had asked once, at an age when children believe questions deserve answers, and her mother had looked at her with an expression so closed and final that she had never asked again. Now, holding a letter from a law firm that smelled faintly of ink and obligation, she understood that gone had meant something far more complicated than she had been allowed to know. The days that followed were a blur of phone calls made during breaks, conversations held in the parking lot of the motel with her phone pressed to one ear and the wind cutting through her jacket. The attorney who handled the estate was patient in the way professionals are when they have delivered similar news many times. He explained that Miriam Kovac had lived alone on the property for over 40 years, that she had maintained it in a manner that was, in his careful phrasing, unconventional, and that the land had been assessed at a value that reflected its condition. When Clara pressed for a number, the silence on the other end lasted just long enough to prepare her. The assessed value of the entire 40-acre parcel, including the lake and all structures, was $11,000. She did not laugh. She did not cry. She simply wrote the number on the back of a receipt and stared at it while the attorney continued speaking about transfer procedures and tax obligations. $11,000 for 40 acres sounded like a punchline to a joke she had not heard the beginning of. But the attorney assured her it was accurate. The land was remote. The lake was not suitable for recreation due to its depth and the instability of its banks, and the structures on the property were, in his words, in a state of significant disrepair. He mentioned that previous inquiries from developers had all ended the same way, with a survey team shaking their heads and driving away. Clara told no one about the inheritance at first. She carried the knowledge like a stone in her pocket, aware of its weight, but unsure what to do with it. At night, after Lily was asleep, she spread the documents across the kitchen table and read them by the light of the single lamp that still worked, tracing the property lines on a map that showed nothing but water and trees and a thin access road that ended in a dotted line. The lake dominated the parcel, a wide, irregular shape that took up nearly 2/3 of the acreage. The remaining land was described as wooded shore with mixed terrain, which Clara translated in her mind as mud and rocks that nobody wanted. She might have ignored it entirely, filed the papers away, and returned to the rhythm of survival that had become her life, if not for the eviction notice that arrived the following week. The landlord had sold the building. The new owners were converting the units into something the letter described as modern living spaces, a phrase that meant the rent would triple and the current tenants would need to leave within 60 days. Clara read that notice, standing in the same spot where she had read the inheritance letter, and the symmetry of it felt less like coincidence than like the world tightening its grip. She told her sister first, not because they were close, but because Margaret was the only family she had left and the only person who might understand the weight of a decision that had no good options. Margaret lived 4 hours south in a house with a mortgage and a husband and 2 children who attended schools with functioning heating systems. She listened to Clara's explanation with the kind of patience that conceals judgment, and when Clara finished, Margaret said what Clara had expected her to say. She said the land was worthless. She said a frozen lake in rural Minnesota was not an inheritance, it was a burden. She said Clara would be insane to uproot Lily for a piece of swamp that a dead stranger had left behind like an afterthought. Clara absorbed the words without argument. She had already run the numbers herself, and they supported everything Margaret said. The cost of moving, of transporting what little they owned across 3 states, of surviving in a place with no job waiting and no community to fall back on, was a calculation that ended in red no matter how she arranged it. But the eviction notice sat on the counter beside the inheritance papers, and a 60-day clock was ticking with the same indifference as every other deadline that had ever pressed against her life. Word spread the way it always did in small, tired places. Clara's co-workers at the motel learned about it first, through a conversation she had not intended to be overheard. Deb mentioned it to the woman who ran the diner next door, who mentioned it to someone at the post office, and within a week, Clara found herself fielding comments from people she barely knew. They were not cruel, not exactly, but they carried a tone she recognized, the same tone people used when they talked about lottery tickets and miracle cures, a mixture of pity and secondhand embarrassment. One of the women at the warehouse told her she had looked at the area online and found nothing but satellite images of white emptiness. She said it looked like the surface of the moon. Another said she had heard of people inheriting land like that and spending years trying to get rid of it, paying taxes on something that would never sell. The comments accumulated like snow on a windshield, each one small enough to brush aside, but together heavy enough to obscure the view. Clara smiled through them, or tried to, offering non-committal responses that satisfied no one, least of all herself. At night, she lay awake and listened to Lily breathing in the next room, counting the days until they would have nowhere to sleep. The math was simple and merciless. She could not afford another apartment in town. She could not move in with Margaret, whose offer had been made with a reluctance that was almost louder than the words themselves. The only place she could go without paying rent was a piece of frozen land that everyone, including the attorney who managed it, had told her was worth almost nothing. She made the decision on a Thursday evening in March, sitting at the kitchen table with the documents spread out one more time and Lily's drawings pinned to the refrigerator behind her. She did not make it because she believed the land held value. She made it because the alternative was homelessness, and she had promised herself years ago, in a hospital room that smelled of endings, that her daughter would always have a roof, even if the roof leaked. The drive took 2 days. Clara's car was old enough to be unreliable, but too necessary to replace, a sedan with a trunk that held everything they owned if she packed it with the precision of someone who had learned that space, like money, must be measured carefully. Lily sat in the back seat, surrounded by garbage bags full of clothes and a single box of books that Clara had refused to leave behind. The child did not ask where they were going or why. She watched the landscape change through the window with the same quiet attention she gave to everything. And when she fell asleep somewhere in Iowa, Clara drove in silence, the road unwinding ahead of her like a question she could not answer. They stopped once at a gas station outside of Des Moines, a place with fluorescent lights that buzzed against a sky turning violet with dusk. Clara filled the tank and calculated the remaining distance against the money in her wallet, a thin fold of bills that represented everything she had withdrawn from an account that was now closed. She bought Lily a sandwich from the cooler and a carton of milk, and they ate sitting on the hood of the car in a parking lot that smelled of diesel and cold asphalt. Lily chewed slowly and looked up at the sky, where the first stars were beginning to puncture the darkness, and asked Clara if the stars were the same everywhere or if different places had different ones. Clara said they were the same stars, just seen from different angles. Lily considered this and said that meant wherever they went, they could still see the same sky. Clara understood that her daughter was not talking about astronomy. She was building a bridge between the life they were leaving and the one they were driving toward, finding continuity in the only thing that could not be taken away from them. They slept in the car that night, reclined seats and blankets pulled from the garbage bags, the engine running in short intervals to keep the heater alive. Clara lay with her eyes open, listening to the trucks pass on the highway and the faint rhythm of Lily's breathing, and she thought about the apartment they had left behind. She had cleaned it before they left, not because the new owners deserved it, but because leaving a place dirty felt like admitting that you had never truly lived there. She had wiped the counters and swept the floors and removed Lily's drawings from the refrigerator one by one, rolling them carefully into a tube that now sat in the footwell of the passenger seat. The last thing she had done was close the front door without locking it, because the key had already been returned, and the sound of that door clicking shut behind her had carried a finality that she was still absorbing 200 miles later. In the morning, they crossed into Minnesota, and the landscape flattened into something so wide and so open that it made Clara feel simultaneously free and exposed. The field stretched to every horizon, winter-brown and stubbled, broken only by the occasional farmstead whose buildings huddled together like people bracing against a wind that was not blowing but would be soon. Lily pressed her face to the window and said it looked like the earth was trying to show you everything at once. Clara glanced in the rearview mirror at her daughter's face, lit by the pale morning sun, and felt a crack in the armor she had been wearing since the eviction notice arrived. The child was not afraid. She was curious. And curiosity, Clara knew, was the one thing that poverty could not destroy, no matter how hard it tried. They arrived in the late afternoon of the second day, following a GPS signal that grew less confident as the roads narrowed. The last stretch was unpaved, rutted and soft from the early thaw, and the car lurched and scraped its way through mud that sucked at the tires with an eagerness that felt personal. When the road ended, Clara stopped the car and sat for a moment, her hands still on the wheel, staring through the windshield at what she had inherited. The lake was still frozen, a vast, flat expanse of gray-white ice that stretched from the muddy shore to a distant tree line that looked like a dark brushstroke against the pale sky. The surface was not smooth. It was rough and textured, scarred by wind and the slow work of seasons, with patches of darker ice where the depth changed and pressure ridges that rose in jagged lines like old wounds. The shore around it was a mess of tangled brush, fallen branches, and rocks that jutted from the mud at angles that suggested the ground itself was unsettled. There were no neighbors visible, no lights, no signs of recent human activity. The silence was enormous, broken only by the faint creak of ice adjusting to the warming air and the distant call of a bird she could not identify. The cabin, if it could be called that, stood about 50 yards from the water's edge, partially obscured by a stand of birch trees whose white bark peeled in long, papery strips. It was small, one story, with a roof that sagged in the middle and walls that had once been painted a color Clara could not determine beneath the layers of weather and neglect. The porch tilted forward as though the house were bowing to the lake, and the front door hung slightly open, swollen in its frame by years of moisture and temperature shifts. Clara could see from where she sat that several windows were cracked, their glass held together by nothing more than habit and grime. Lily pressed her face to the car window and said it looked like a house from a storybook, the kind where someone had been sleeping for 100 years. Clara wanted to correct her, to manage the expectation before it could harden into disappointment, but the comparison was so precise and so innocent that she could not bring herself to speak. Instead, she opened the car door and stepped out on a ground that immediately tried to swallow her shoes. The mud was deep and cold, the kind that held on to everything it touched. She pulled Lily from the back seat and carried her to the porch, which groaned under their combined weight but held. The front door required a shoulder to open, scraping across warped floorboards with a sound that echoed through the empty rooms like an announcement. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of damp wood and old paper, a scent that was not entirely unpleasant, but carried with it the unmistakable presence of decay. The walls were bare except for water stains that had formed patterns resembling maps of places that did not exist. The floor was covered in a layer of dust so fine it looked like ash, disturbed only by the tracks of small animals that had claimed the space long before Clara arrived. There was a wood stove in the corner of the main room, rusted but intact, its pipe disappearing into the ceiling at an angle that suggested it had been installed by someone with more determination than expertise. A kitchen area occupied the back wall, consisting of a hand pump over a stone sink, a row of cabinets whose doors hung open to reveal empty shelves, and a countertop made from a single slab of wood that had warped into a gentle curve. A doorway led to a second room, just large enough for a bed frame with no mattress and a window that looked out onto the frozen lake. Clara stood in the center of the main room and turned slowly, taking in the full measure of what $11,000 and 40 acres looked like when they were real. The cabin was not livable, not by any standard she had known, but it was a structure with walls and a roof and a door that closed, and in her current arithmetic, that was enough to begin. Lily explored the cabin with the fearless curiosity of a child who had not yet learned to see ruin as defeat. She opened cabinets and peered inside, ran her fingers along the stone sink, pressed her nose to the cracked window, and stared at the lake as though it were an ocean she had been promised. She found a small wooden box tucked into a gap between the wall and the stove, its lid swollen shut. Clara helped her pry it open, and they discovered inside a collection of objects that seemed chosen for their strangeness rather than their value. A brass compass with a cracked face, a spool of wire so old it had turned green, a folded piece of paper that disintegrated at the touch, and beneath it all, a photograph, faded nearly to nothing, of a woman standing at the edge of a lake with her hand resting on what appeared to be a piece of heavy equipment half sunk in the mud. Clara held the photograph to the light of the window and studied the woman's face. The features were indistinct, blurred by time and exposure, but there was something in the posture, the way the woman stood as though she owned not just the land but the water and the sky above it, that made Clara's breath catch. She turned the photograph over and found a single line written in pencil so faint it was barely legible. It read, "They will see when the water goes." She did not know what it meant. She tucked the photograph into her coat pocket and returned to the work of making the cabin habitable, pushing the mystery aside with the same efficiency she used to push aside every question that did not have an immediate, practical answer. There would be time for wondering later. Right now, there was a wood stove to test, a floor to sweep, and a child to feed before the light failed entirely. The first night was the hardest. The wood stove worked, but poorly, filling the cabin with smoke before the draft finally caught and pulled the worst of it upward. Clara fed it with branches she gathered from the yard, dry enough to burn but green enough to pop and hiss in a way that made Lily giggle from beneath the pile of blankets they had arranged on the floor near the heat. The temperature outside dropped steadily as darkness closed in, and the cabin walls did little to keep it out. Clara lay awake listening to the ice on the lake shift and groan, a sound she had never heard before, deep and resonant, as though the water beneath were turning in its sleep. She thought about the photograph in her pocket and the woman who had stood at the lake's edge with such certainty. She thought about her mother, who had never spoken of this place, and about the grandmother who had lived here alone for decades, maintaining a property that the world had dismissed as worthless. She thought about the words on the back of the photograph, cryptic and deliberate, written by someone who wanted them to be found but not yet understood. And she thought about the lake itself, vast and frozen and patient, holding whatever it held beneath a surface that reflected nothing back but sky. In the morning, she woke to the sound of water, not the drip of a leaking roof or the trickle of a pipe, but a steady, low murmur that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. She rose and crossed to the window, pulling aside the cloth she had hung for a curtain, and looked out at the lake. The ice had changed overnight. Where it had been a uniform gray-white, there were now veins of dark water running through it, thin channels where the surface had begun to crack and separate. The thaw was starting earlier than she had expected, and the lake was responding with a slow, almost deliberate transformation that made her think of something waking up. She did not yet know what the thaw would reveal. She did not yet understand why her grandmother had spent 40 years on this shore, watching the water with the patience of someone who knew a secret too large to speak aloud. All she knew was that the lake was changing, and that the sound it made as the ice began to break was not random. It was rhythmic, almost purposeful, as though the water had been waiting for someone to arrive before it began to show what it had been keeping. Clara pulled her coat on and stepped outside in air that was cold but softer than the night before. The sun sat low on the horizon, casting a pale gold light across the ice that made the dark veins glitter. She walked to the water's edge, her boots sinking into the mud, and stood where her grandmother had stood in the photograph. The lake stretched out before her, enormous and unknowable, and for the first time since she had opened the letter in her kitchen, she felt something other than desperation. She felt curiosity, and beneath it, buried so deep she almost missed it, the faintest stirring of hope. The first week on the property tested Clara in ways she had not anticipated. The cabin demanded attention the way a sick animal does, constantly and without gratitude. She spent the mornings patching the worst of the gaps in the walls with materials she found in a shed behind the house, a structure so overgrown with brush that she had not noticed it until Lily pointed out the rusted padlock half hidden by vines. Inside, she discovered tools that had been stored with care, each one cleaned and hung on hooks that someone had driven into the beams at precise intervals. There were saws, hammers, chisels, a hand drill with a set of bits arranged by size, and a collection of wrenches that looked as though they had been used recently despite the layer of dust that covered everything else. Whoever Miriam Kovac had been, she had not been a woman who let tools go to waste. Clara used what she found to seal the windows, reinforce the porch, and fashion a crude door latch that would keep the wind from pushing its way inside at night. She was not skilled at this kind of work, but she was persistent in the way that only people with no alternative can be, and each small repair felt like a sentence added to a conversation with the woman who had lived here before her. The cabin began to change, not into something comfortable, but into something that could be endured. The nearest town was a 40-minute drive on roads that alternated between gravel and mud, depending on the weather. It was called Harlan, and it occupied a stretch of highway so small that Clara drove through it twice before realizing she had already passed everything there was to see. A gas station with a convenience store attached, a post office that shared a building with the county clerk, a diner with a handwritten menu taped to the window, a feed store that also sold hardware, ammunition, and lottery tickets. The people who lived there were not hostile, but they were watchful in the way of communities that had learned to be suspicious of outsiders, not out of malice, but out of the simple arithmetic that new arrivals usually wanted something from a place that had very little left to give. Clara's first visit to the diner was enough to establish her reputation. She sat at the counter with Lily beside her, both of them eating soup that cost less than anything else on the menu, and listened as the woman behind the register spoke to a man at the end of the bar about the Kovac place. The conversation was not whispered. It was conducted at the volume of people who saw no reason to hide their opinions from someone they considered temporary. The woman said she remembered Miriam. Strange woman. Lived out there alone for God knows how long. Never came to town unless she had to. And when she did, she bought the oddest things. Pipe fittings, industrial sealant, rolls of copper wire by the spool. The man at the end of the bar snorted and said the old woman had been crazy, plain and simple. He said the lake was a dead zone, too deep in places, too shallow in others, full of silt, and that the county had been trying to get someone to take the property off the tax rolls for years. He said he felt sorry for whoever had been fool enough to inherit it. Clara did not turn around. She finished her soup, paid, and drove back to the property with Lily asleep in the back seat and the man's words settling into her chest like sediment. She had heard variations of the same opinion from everyone she had spoken to since arriving. The property was worthless. The lake was a liability. The only sensible thing to do was sell the land for whatever it would bring and move somewhere with plumbing. The feed store was worse. Clara had gone in looking for basic supplies, nails and weatherproofing tape, and a bag of sand for the porch steps that turned to ice sheets every morning. The man behind the counter was tall and unhurried, the kind of person who filled silence with opinions the way other people filled it with music. He recognized her before she reached the register, not by name, but by circumstance. "You're the one who took the Kovac place," he said, not as a question, but as a diagnosis. He leaned on the counter and told her what he thought she should hear. He said the property had been a running joke in the county for as long as he could remember. He said the previous owner, and he used the word loosely, as though Miriam's decades of residence did not qualify, had once come in asking for 50 feet of copper pipe and a roll of marine-grade sealant, and that he had sold it to her knowing full well it would end up in the mud like everything else out there. He said the lake had no bottom worth speaking of and no fish worth catching, and that the only thing it produced reliably was mosquitoes. He said all of this while ringing up her purchases, and when he told her the total, he added that she might want to save her money for a bus ticket back to wherever she had come from. Clara paid without responding. She carried the bag to her car and sat behind the wheel for several minutes before starting the engine. Not because the words had wounded her, but because they had landed on wounds that were already open. She had spent her entire adult life being told, in ways both direct and implied, that she was not enough. Not earning enough, not providing enough, not stable enough. The comments in Harlan were different only in their specificity. They targeted not her character, but her judgment, and that distinction made them harder to dismiss, because judgment was the one thing she had left to trust. The school enrollment had been its own kind of trial. Clara had driven Lily to the building on a Monday morning, both of them dressed in the cleanest clothes they owned, which were clean but not new and carried the softness of fabric that had been washed too many times. The principal met them in a hallway that smelled of floor wax and old paper. A man named Gunderson whose handshake was firm and whose smile was the practiced kind that did not commit to anything. He reviewed Clara's paperwork with the careful attention of someone looking for reasons to say no. He asked about their permanent address, and Clara gave the property coordinates because there was no street number. He asked about immunization records, and Clara produced photocopies that were slightly blurred from the printer at the gas station. He asked about the previous school, and Clara gave a name that meant nothing to him and everything to her, because it was the last place where Lily had felt normal. He approved the enrollment, but not before mentioning that the school had limited resources and that students who joined mid-year sometimes struggled to adjust. He said it with a gentleness that was worse than bluntness, because it carried the implication that Clara's instability was already affecting her child. Lily sat in one of the small chairs in the hallway during the conversation, her feet not quite reaching the floor, her backpack in her lap, watching the other children pass by with the measuring gaze of someone deciding whether a new place was safe. When they left, Lily asked if the man thought they would stay. Clara said yes, they would stay. She said it with a certainty she manufactured on the spot. because a child who had already been uprooted once did not need to hear that her mother was running calculations in her head about how long the gas in the car would last and whether the wood stove could keep them alive through the final weeks of cold. She heard it at the post office when she went to set up a forwarding address. The clerk looked at the property description on the form and raised her eyebrows in an expression that fell somewhere between sympathy and amusement. She said she hoped Clara had a good pair of boots because the Kovac land was more water than solid ground, and that the lake had a reputation for swallowing things. Fence posts, dock pilings, a tractor, supposedly, that had gone through the ice decades ago and never been recovered. Clara nodded and took her receipt and walked out into a parking lot where two men leaned against a truck and watched her with the frank curiosity of people who had already decided she would not last the summer. She heard it from Margaret, too, in phone calls that came every few days and carried the weight of an argument neither of them wanted to have openly. Margaret did not say Clara had made a mistake. She said things that meant the same thing, but sounded gentler. She asked about schools for Lily. She asked about heating costs. She asked whether Clara had thought about what would happen when winter came back and the roads became impassable. Each question was a stone placed carefully on a scale that was already tipping toward doubt, and Clara answered them all with a steadiness she did not feel, because the alternative was admitting that she had driven her daughter across 3 states to live in a ruin beside a lake that no one wanted. She had tried to find work in Harlan during the first 2 weeks. She had walked into every business on the highway with a manner that balanced between confident and humble, the posture of someone who has spent years asking for things without appearing to beg. The gas station was not hiring. The diner had a full staff, which meant 2 waitresses and the owner's wife, and none of them were leaving. The feed store did not need help. The woman who ran the small motel on the county road, a place even more threadbare than the one Clara had cleaned back east, listened to Clara's experience with the expression of someone solving a math problem in her head, and then said she could not afford another pair of hands. She said it with genuine regret, which made it worse than the refusals that came with indifference. Clara had driven home from that last attempt with the windows down and the spring air cutting through the car, and she had pulled over on the shoulder of the road a mile from the property and sat with her hands on the wheel and her forehead against her knuckles and allowed herself exactly 3 minutes of despair. She counted the seconds in her head the way she counted everything, with precision and an awareness that each unit was finite. When the 3 minutes were over, she wiped her face with the back of her hand, put the car in gear, and drove the rest of the way home. She had a daughter to feed, a cabin to repair, and a journal full of handwriting that she had not yet finished reading. Self-pity was a luxury with a price she could not pay, and she had learned long ago that the difference between the people who survived and the people who did not was not strength or luck. It was the willingness to keep moving after the 3 minutes were up. But the lake itself did not seem to agree with the consensus. As the days passed and the temperature climbed in small, hesitant increments, the ice continued its slow retreat. The dark veins Clara had noticed on that first morning widened into channels, and the channels merged into open patches of water that reflected the sky with a clarity that startled her. The sound of the thaw grew louder, a constant murmur punctuated by sharp cracks when large sections of ice broke free and shifted against one another. She found herself drawn to the shore each morning, standing in the same spot, watching the transformation with an attention she could not explain. It was during one of these morning vigils that she noticed something she had overlooked before. At the far end of the lake, where the shore curved inward and the brush grew thickest, the water level was lower than she expected. Not by much, not enough to alarm, but enough to expose a rim of dark, compacted earth along the bank that had clearly been underwater for a long time. She walked the perimeter to get a closer look, her boots squelching through mud that released a smell of old metal and whetstone. The exposed strip was smooth and even too regular to be natural erosion. It looked as though the water had been pulled back deliberately, like a curtain drawn away from a window. She followed the exposed rim to a point where the bank dipped sharply downward, and there she found the first real clue. Set into the mud at the waterline, half buried in green with algae, was a pipe. Not a natural formation, not a root, but a manufactured pipe, perhaps 4 inches in diameter, made of a material that felt like heavy ceramic when she scraped the growth away with her fingernail. It was angled downward, pointed into the earth beneath the lake, and when she pressed her ear to the opening, she heard something that made her pull back and stare at the dark circle as though it had spoken to her. Air, moving air, flowing steadily from somewhere below, carrying with it a scent she could not place, but that reminded her of basements and sealed rooms and things that had been kept in the dark for a very long time. She straightened up and looked out across the lake, its surface now a patchwork of ice and open water, gleaming in the weak spring sun. The pipe was not an accident. It had been placed here by someone who understood the land well enough to know exactly where to put it, and it was connected to something beneath the water that was large enough to breathe. Clara returned to the cabin and pulled the photograph from the drawer where she had placed it. She held it up to the light and studied the background more carefully this time. The heavy equipment her grandmother had been resting her hand on was not sunk in the mud, as she had first assumed. It was positioned at the water's edge, angled toward the lake, and its shape, now that she looked with new eyes, was not the shape of a tractor or a plow. It was the shape of a pump, an industrial water pump, the kind used to drain flooded basements or construction sites, capable of moving thousands of gallons per hour. She turned the photograph over and read the words again. They will see when the water goes. The ice was melting. The water was dropping. And somewhere beneath the surface of a lake that everyone had told her was worthless, something was waiting to be uncovered. Clara did not know what it was. She did not know if it was worth finding. But she knew, with a certainty that felt more like inheritance than logic, that her grandmother had spent 40 years on this shore for a reason. And that reason was not madness. It was patience. She set the photograph on the windowsill, propped against the glass where the morning light could reach it. Then she went outside, walked to the shed, and began looking for anything that resembled a pump. What she found instead stopped her in the doorway. Behind the tools, hidden beneath a canvas tarp that had stiffened with age into the shape of the objects it covered, was a collection of items that did not belong in a garden shed. Rolled blueprints, their edges yellowed and brittle. A leather-bound journal filled with handwriting so small and dense it looked like code. And beneath it all, stacked in careful rows against the back wall, were dozens of glass jars, each one sealed with wax and labeled with dates that spanned 4 decades. Clara picked up the nearest jar and held it to the light. Inside, suspended in a liquid that had turned the color of weak tea, was a sample of something dark and granular, flecked with points of light that caught the sun and threw it back in tiny sparks. She did not know what she was looking at, but the weight of the jar in her hand, the meticulous labeling, the care with which each sample had been preserved, told her that her grandmother had not been watching the lake out of loneliness or habit. She had been studying it, measuring it, waiting for it to give up what it held. And now, with the ice breaking and the water dropping, and the spring sun pressing down on a surface that had kept its secrets through 40 frozen winters, the waiting was almost over. Clara spent the rest of that day on the floor of the shed with the journal open across her knees and the glass jars arranged in a semicircle around her like an audience waiting to be addressed. The handwriting inside the journal was small and deliberate, the kind that belonged to a person who understood that paper was limited and thoughts were not. The entries were not dated in the conventional sense. Instead, each one was marked with a season and a water level, as though time itself was measured not by calendars but by the behavior of the lake. Spring, 14, 2 feet. Autumn, 16, 8 feet. Winter, frozen solid at 17, 1 feet. The numbers formed a pattern that Clara could feel even before she understood it. The lake rose and fell with the seasons, but over the span of decades, the overall trend was unmistakable. The water was slowly, almost imperceptibly, dropping. The journal entries were not poetic. They were observations recorded with the precision of a scientist and the patience of someone who had accepted that the results of her work might not arrive in her lifetime. Miriam wrote about sediment samples taken from the exposed banks during low-water years. She wrote about the composition of the lake bed, about layers of glacial till and clay, and something she referred to repeatedly as the substrate, a dense, mineral-rich formation that lay beneath the silt at a depth she estimated to be between 8 and 12 feet below the current waterline. She wrote about core samples she had taken using equipment she had built herself from salvage pipe and a hand winch, lowering hollow tubes into the lake bed and pulling them back up filled with material that she then sealed in the glass jars Clara had found. The samples told a story that Miriam had pieced together over 4 decades of solitary research. The lake was not natural, or rather, it had not always been a lake. The glacial depression that held the water had once been dry land, a shallow valley that had been flooded centuries ago when a natural dam of compacted earth and rock had formed at the northern end, trapping snowmelt and rainwater in a basin that grew deeper with each passing year. Beneath the water and the silt and the layers of organic decay that had accumulated over time, the original valley floor was intact, and embedded in that floor, according to Miriam's meticulous notes, was a mineral deposit of extraordinary significance. Clara read the word 3 times before she trusted her understanding of it. Gold, not the romantic, nugget-in-a-stream gold of frontier legends, but a geological formation known as a lode deposit, a vein of gold-bearing quartz that ran through the bedrock beneath the glacial till. Miriam had identified it through the sediment samples, tracing the presence of fine gold particles in the silt that washed up along the banks during low-water years. She had documented the concentration, the distribution, the depth at which the particles appeared, and the direction from which they seemed to originate. Every jar in the shed was a data point. Every entry in the journal was a measurement, and every measurement pointed to the same conclusion. The lake was sitting on top of a fortune that no one had ever thought to look for, because no one had ever thought to look beneath a body of water that the entire county had dismissed as worthless. Clara closed the journal and sat in the dusty silence of the shed, staring at the jars with their dark, glittering contents. Her hands were trembling, not from cold, but from the sudden, overwhelming weight of understanding. Her grandmother had known. She had known for decades, and she had told no one. She had lived alone on this shore, collecting samples, recording data, maintaining the property with a vigilance that her neighbors had mistaken for eccentricity, all while sitting on a discovery that could have changed her life at any moment. The question that pressed hardest against Clara's mind was not what lay beneath the lake. It was why Miriam had never acted on what she knew. The answer came in the final pages of the journal, written in a hand that had grown less steady but no less precise. Miriam explained that she had considered mining the deposit herself, but had concluded that the scale of the operation required resources she did not possess. She had also considered selling the information to a mining company, but had rejected this option for reasons she described with a clarity that made Clara's throat tighten. She wrote that the land had been in her family before the lake existed, that her own grandmother had told stories of the valley before the water came, and that selling the knowledge to strangers would mean losing control of something that belonged not to her, but to the people who came after. She wrote that she had tried to contact her daughter, Clara's mother, many times over the years and had been refused each time. She wrote that the estrangement was her greatest failure and that the inheritance was her only remaining way to speak across the silence that had grown between them. The final entry was dated less than a year before Miriam's death. It was brief and written with the calm finality of someone who had made peace with the limits of her own time. It said that the lake's water level had been dropping steadily for the past 5 years, faster than at any point in her records. It said that the natural dam at the northern end was weakening, eroded by decades of freeze and thaw cycles that were accelerating as the climate shifted. It said that within a few years, perhaps sooner, the lake would begin to drain on its own. And it said that when it did, Whoever stood on this shore would see what she had spent her life protecting. They will see when the water goes. Clara carried the journal back to the cabin and placed it on the table beside the photograph. Lily was drawing at the other end of the table, her pencil moving in slow, careful strokes across paper that Clara had found in a drawer. The child looked up and studied her mother's face with the perceptive stillness that had always made Clara feel both proud and exposed. Lily asked if she had found something interesting in the shed. Clara said yes, and that she would explain it when she understood it better herself. It was not a lie, but it was not the truth either, and the distance between the two felt wider than it ever had. That night, Clara read the journal again from the beginning, this time with a pencil in her hand, marking passages and cross-referencing the water level data with the dates on the sample jars. The pattern was undeniable. Every time the lake dropped below a certain threshold, the concentration of gold particles in the shoreline sediment increased sharply. Miriam had charted this correlation across 40 years of data, and the curve was exponential. The lower the water fell, the richer the samples became, as though the lake were slowly surrendering its secret 1 inch at a time. Clara did not sleep that night. She sat at the table until the wood stove burned low and the cabin grew cold, and then she sat in the cold, wrapped in a blanket, watching the first gray light of dawn creep across the frozen surface of the lake. She thought about the pipe she had found at the waterline. She thought about the pump and the photograph. She thought about the blueprints in the shed that she had not yet unrolled. And she thought about the woman who had spent 40 years preparing for a moment she would never see, trusting that someone would come after her who was desperate enough, or stubborn enough, to finish what she had started. In the morning, Clara unrolled the blueprints on the cabin floor and anchored their corners with rocks. They were hand-drawn, precise and detailed, rendered in the same small, deliberate hand as the journal. They showed the lake from above, its contours marked with depth measurements that Miriam had taken over decades using weighted lines dropped from a rowboat. But the blueprints also showed something else. Beneath the water, sketched in a different color of ink, was a network of pipes and channels that connected to a central pump station located at the northern end of the lake, exactly where the natural dam was weakest. Miriam had designed a drainage system, not a crude, brute force operation, but a carefully engineered plan to accelerate the lake's natural decline by directing the water through the weakening dam and into the creek bed that ran beyond the property line. The system used gravity and the existing topography to do most of the work. The pump was needed only to start the flow and to manage the rate so that the drainage would be gradual enough to avoid flooding the downstream land. Clara studied the blueprints for hours, tracing the lines with her finger, matching each component to the materials she had found in the shed. The pipes were already in place. Miriam had installed them over the years, buried in the mud along the lake bed, and connected to the ceramic fittings that Clara had discovered at the waterline. The pump station was partially built, its foundation visible in the blueprints as a concrete pad that Miriam had poured at the base of the dam. All that remained was the pump itself and the connections that would link the buried network to the outflow channel. The realization hit Clara with a force that made her sit back on her heels and press her hands against the cold floor. Her grandmother had not just discovered the gold. She had spent decades preparing to reveal it. Every strange purchase from the hardware store in town, every spool of copper wire, every length of pipe, had been a piece of a puzzle that only Miriam could see. The woman the town had called crazy had been an engineer, a geologist, and a planner of extraordinary patience, working alone on a project that most people would have abandoned in its first year. Clara drove into Harlan that afternoon with a list of supplies written on the back of an envelope. She bought fuel for the generator she had found in the shed, a collection of hose fittings and clamps, and a used submersible pump from a man who ran a drainage business out of his garage and who looked at her with mild suspicion when she described what she needed it for. She told him she was clearing standing water from her property, which was true in the most literal and least informative sense possible. He sold her the pump at a price that was fair and loaded it into her trunk with the kind of help that comes from curiosity rather than generosity. The drive back felt longer than usual. The pump sat in the trunk like a passenger with its own intentions, and Clara found herself talking to it under her breath, the way she sometimes talked to the car when it hesitated on cold mornings. She told it that she did not know if this would work. She told it that the blueprints were 40 years old and the pipes might be cracked or clogged or collapsed. She told it that she was a woman who cleaned motel rooms and packed boxes for a living, and that she had no business attempting an engineering project designed by a grandmother she had never met. The pump did not respond, but the weight of it in the trunk felt like an answer anyway. She began the work the next morning, after dropping Lily at the small school in Harlan, where she had enrolled her with paperwork that was still technically incomplete. The school was a single building with 3 classrooms and a principal who doubled as the 4th-grade teacher, and Lily had taken to it with a quiet adaptability that made Clara both grateful and guilty. The child deserved stability, not a mother who was about to drain a lake on the advice of a dead woman's journal. The night before she started the pump, Clara could not sleep. She lay on the floor of the cabin beside Lily, staring at the ceiling where water stains had mapped their own geography across the plaster, and she felt the full weight of what she was about to attempt pressed down on her like a hand against her chest. She was not an engineer. She was not a geologist. She was a woman who had spent the last 3 years cleaning other people's rooms and packing other people's purchases, and now she was going to connect a second-hand pump to a 40-year-old pipe network buried in the mud of a glacial lake bed, and hope that the whole thing did not collapse or flood or simply fail in a way that proved everyone in Harlan right. The doubt was not abstract. It was physical, a tightness in her ribs and a heat behind her eyes that she recognized as the precursor to tears she could not afford to shed. She got up and walked to the window. The lake was a dark mirror under a sky salted with stars, its surface perfectly still, reflecting the heavens with a fidelity that made it impossible to tell where the water ended and the sky began. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass and spoke to the lake the way she sometimes spoke to the car or the pump or the photograph. She told it that she did not know what she was doing. She told it that she was afraid of failing and equally afraid of succeeding, because success would mean that her grandmother had been right all along, and that every person who had dismissed this place, including the part of Clara that had almost thrown the papers away, had been wrong in a way that could never be fully corrected. She told the lake that she needed it to cooperate, that she and her daughter had nowhere else to go and nothing else to try, and that if Miriam's pipes held and the pump worked and the water moved the way the blueprint said it would, she would take care of whatever lay beneath the surface with the same patience that had put it there. The lake did not answer, but the ice cracked somewhere in the distance, a single sharp report like a branch breaking under snow, and the sound traveled across the water and through the glass and into Clara's body with a clarity that felt, in that moment, like acknowledgement. She returned to the blankets beside Lily and closed her eyes, and when sleep finally came, it brought no dreams she could remember, only the deep, still rest of someone who has made a decision and released the need to make it again. The northern end of the lake was accessible only by a path that Miriam had cut through the brush years earlier, now overgrown, but still traceable if you knew what to look for. Clara followed it with the pump strapped to a handcart she had fashioned from boards and wheels salvaged from a shed. The ground was soft and uneven, and the cart tipped twice before she reached the dam, a natural berm of compacted earth and stone that rose about 6 feet above the waterline and stretched perhaps 30 yards across the narrow end of the basin. On the other side, the land dropped away into a dry creek bed that wound through the trees and disappeared toward the county road. The concrete pad was there, exactly where the blueprints said it would be. It was cracked but solid, its surface covered in a layer of moss that came away in sheets when Clara scraped it with a shovel. The pipe connections emerged from the ground on either side of the pad, their ceramic ends sealed with caps that Miriam had fitted with a precision that spoke of forethought and care. Clara removed the caps and felt again the steady flow of air from below, stronger here than at the single pipe she had found on the shore. The network was intact. The pipes had held. She connected the pump to the outflow pipe and ran the intake line down the bank to the water line, where the ice had now retreated enough to expose a wide crescent of open water. The generator coughed and caught on the third pull, its sound swallowed almost immediately by the trees. She primed the pump, checked the connections one more time, and then stood with her hand on the switch, staring at the lake as though asking its permission. The water began to move almost immediately, not with the dramatic rush she had imagined, but with a steady, purposeful flow that traveled through the buried pipes and emerged from the outflow channel on the other side of the dam in a clear, cold stream that darkened the dry creek bed and began to find its way downhill. The pump hummed at a frequency that vibrated through the ground beneath her feet, and the water level at the intake dropped by a fraction of an inch, then another, so slowly that the change was visible only if you watched without blinking. Clara sat on the concrete pad and watched the lake begin to shrink. The process was not fast. Miriam's blueprints had estimated that draining the lake to the level of the substrate would take weeks, depending on the pump's capacity and the rate at which groundwater and snowmelt replenished the basin. But the direction was unmistakable. For the first time in perhaps centuries, the water was going out faster than it was coming in. The lake, which had swallowed tractors and dock pilings and the ambitions of everyone who had ever looked at it, was yielding. She returned every day, checking the pump, adjusting the flow, monitoring the water level with a wooden stake she had driven into the mud at the shoreline and marked with pencil lines at regular intervals. Each day the line was lower. Each day the exposed bank grew wider, revealing more of the dark, compacted earth that had been hidden beneath the surface. The smell of the exposed lake bed was rich and complex, a blend of organic decay and mineral sharpness that reminded Clara of the inside of the sample jars. She began collecting her own samples, scooping mud into mason jars she had bought in town and holding them up to the light the way she had seen described in the journal. The glitter was there, faint but present, scattered through the silt like stars in a cloudy sky. One afternoon, while Clara was checking the pump, Lily appeared on the path through the brush, her school shoes muddy and her backpack bouncing against her spine. She had taken to walking the last stretch from the bus stop alone, a half-mile of unpaved road that would have terrified Clara if she had not already exhausted her capacity for fear on things that mattered more. Lily stood at the edge of the receding water and looked out across the basin with an expression that Clara had never seen on her daughter's face before. It was not wonder exactly, and it was not confusion. It was the look of someone realizing that the world is larger than they had been told. She asked Clara why the lake was getting smaller. Clara knelt beside her and explained as simply as she could that the water was draining through a system her grandmother had built and that there might be something important underneath. Lily considered this for a moment, her eyes tracing the dark ring of exposed earth that circled the shrinking water like a frame around a picture that was still developing. Then she asked a question that Clara had not expected. She asked if the grandmother had been lonely. Clara opened her mouth to answer and found that she could not, because the question was not about Miriam's solitude. It was about recognition. Lily had lived with loneliness long enough to identify it in someone she had never met, across decades and through the pages of a journal she had never read. Clara put her arm around her daughter and said that she thought Miriam had been very lonely, but that she had also been very sure of something, and that sometimes being sure of something is enough to make loneliness bearable. Lily leaned into her and said nothing more, and they sat together watching the water retreat until the sun began to lower and the mud turned the color of copper in the fading light. That evening, Clara found a passage in the journal she had missed before. It was written in the margin of a page devoted to water level measurements, almost as an afterthought. Miriam had written, "I imagine sometimes that the girl will stand here. I imagine she will understand why I stayed. That is enough. That has to be enough." Clara closed the journal and pressed her hand against the cover, as though the contact could travel backward through time and reach the woman who had written those words in a cabin not much different from the one Clara sat in now. She whispered that the girl was here, and that she was beginning to understand. The town noticed the change before Clara was ready for it to be noticed. A farmer whose land bordered the creek downstream mentioned to someone at the feed store that his pasture ditch had been running higher than usual. The woman at the diner asked Clara, with studied casualness, whether she was having water problems on her property. The man at the gas station mentioned that he had driven past the Kovac place and noticed the lake looked smaller than he remembered. Clara answered each inquiry with the same careful vagueness she had learned to use when the questions were about her finances or her plans. She said the thaw was heavier this year. She said the natural dam was eroding. She said nothing about the pump or the blueprints or the jars in the shed. But the lake did not cooperate with her secrecy. As the weeks passed and the water continued to drop, the changes became too dramatic to explain away. The shoreline receded by yards, not inches, exposing a ring of dark mud that glistened in the spring sun and attracted flocks of birds that had never been seen on the property before. The shape of the lake bed began to emerge, not the flat, featureless bottom everyone had assumed, but a contoured landscape of ridges and depressions that suggested the original valley floor was far more complex than the surface had let on. And at the center of the lake, where the water was deepest and the last of the ice still clung in stubborn patches, something began to show through the thinning surface, a shape that was too regular, too geometric to be natural. Clara saw it first from the cabin window on a morning in late April when the sun was low and the light hit the water at an angle that turned it transparent. She stopped mid-step, coffee mug halfway to her lips, and stared at the lake with the same frozen intensity she imagined her grandmother must have felt the first time a sample jar caught the light. There, beneath perhaps 3 feet of water, was the outline of a structure. Not a rock formation, not a fallen tree, but something built, something with straight edges and right angles, and a presence that defied the soft, organic curves of the lake bed around it. The mug slipped from her fingers and shattered on the floor, and she did not look down. Coffee spread across the boards in a dark pool that soaked into the wood the way water soaks into earth, and Clara stood at the window with her hand pressed against the glass, and her heart beating so hard she could feel it in her throat. She had believed the journal. She had trusted the samples and the blueprints and the photograph and the words on its back. But believing and seeing are separated by a distance that no amount of faith can fully cross, and the shape beneath the water was the bridge between them. It was proof, not of gold or of wealth or of value in any monetary sense, but of Miriam. Proof that the woman who had lived alone on this shore for 40 years had not been dreaming. She had been right. She had been right all along, and the rightness of it was now visible to anyone who stood at this window and looked out a lake that was finally thin enough to show what it had been hiding. Clara pulled on her boots without tying them and walked to the shore with the speed of someone who is afraid that what they have seen will disappear if they take their eyes off it for too long. She walked to the shore and waded in up to her knees, the cold water soaking through her boots and sending a shock up her legs that she barely registered. The structure was clearer from this angle, its outline sharpening as the water continued to drain. It appeared to be a building of some kind, long and low, with walls made of stone or concrete that had withstood the pressure of the water above it for what must have been decades. She could see the upper edge of what looked like a doorway, its frame still intact, still holding its shape against the weight of the world that had been piled on top of it. She went back to the journal and found the passage she had been looking for. Miriam had written about the structure in an entry dated 23 years earlier, when an unusually dry summer had dropped the lake to its lowest recorded level. She had waded out to the center and felt the walls with her hands, unable to see through the murky water, but able to trace the outline by touch. She described it as a vault built into the bedrock of the valley floor, its construction suggesting professional engineering and materials that were not locally sourced. She speculated that it had been built before the lake formed, when the valley was still dry, and that whoever had built it had either not anticipated the flooding or had deliberately allowed the water to cover their work. The vault, Miriam believed, was where the gold was concentrated, not scattered through the silt in trace amounts, but stored, refined, and sealed in a structure designed to protect it from exactly the kind of accidental discovery that a dropping water level might produce. She theorized that the deposit had been found and partially excavated decades before she arrived, perhaps during the mining boom that had swept through northern Minnesota in the early 20th century, and that whoever had done the work had chosen to hide rather than declare it. The reasons she could only guess at: tax evasion, claim disputes, the kind of secretive hoarding that isolation and wealth sometimes produce in people who trust no one. Clara stood at the water's edge and watched the outline of the vault grow clearer as the pump continued its steady work. The water level was dropping faster now, as though the lake had passed some tipping point and gravity was doing more of the work than the pump. She could see details she had not noticed before: metal fittings along the top of the walls, a pipe similar to the ones Miriam had installed, running along the base of the structure and disappearing into the mud. And on the surface of a nearest wall, partially obscured by algae and sediment, what appeared to be markings. Letters or numbers, carved or stamped into the stone with the permanence of something meant to endure. She waited. She had learned patience from a woman she had never met, inherited it along with the land and the lake and the journal full of careful observations. She waited as the water dropped another foot, and then another, exposing the upper half of the vault's walls and confirming what the journal had described. The structure was approximately 40 feet long and 20 feet wide, built from reinforced concrete with steel framing that showed remarkably little corrosion. The doorway she had spotted was sealed with a metal plate, bolted into the frame with hardware that looked industrial, the kind used in bank vaults or military installations. It was, in every respect, a building that had been constructed to last and then deliberately submerged beneath a lake that no one would ever think to drain. On the first day of May, the water level dropped below the threshold of the door. Clara waded out in rubber boots she had bought in Harlan, the water now only ankle-deep around the base of the vault. She pressed her hand against the metal plate and felt the solidity of it, the absolute refusal of it to yield to anything less than deliberate effort. The bolts were rusted but intact, their heads worn smooth by decades of underwater erosion. She would need tools she did not have, strength she was not sure she possessed, and time that the growing curiosity of the town might not allow her. She returned to the shed and found, in a compartment she had not previously opened, a heavy canvas bag containing a socket set, a breaker bar, and a bottle of penetrating oil that Miriam had labeled in her own hand with the date and the words for the door. Clara held the bottle for a long moment, feeling the weight of a woman's lifetime of preparation pressing against her palm. Then she put the bag over her shoulder and walked back to the lake. The bolts resisted. They resisted the penetrating oil and the socket set and the breaker bar and the full weight of Clara's body leaning into the handle until her arms shook and her vision blurred. She worked for 3 hours, moving from bolt to bolt, applying oil, waiting, trying again, feeling each fractional turn like a victory won against decades of corrosion and concealment. Her hands blistered within the first hour, the skin on her palms tearing against the metal handle in a way that reminded her of the first weeks at the motel, when the cleaning chemicals had stripped the moisture from her fingers until they cracked and bled. She wrapped her hands in strips of cloth torn from an old shirt and kept going because stopping was not a vocabulary she had ever learned. The third bolt was the worst. It was set deeper into the frame than the others, and the corrosion had fused it to the plate with the stubbornness of something that intended to remain forever. She soaked it in oil 3 times, waited 10 minutes between each application, and then bore down on the breaker bar with everything she had. The metal groaned, but did not turn. She repositioned her feet in the mud, braced the bar against her hip, and pushed until her legs trembled and her breath came in short, ragged gasps that tasted of lake water and iron. The bolt moved a quarter turn and stopped. She rested, her forehead against the cool steel of the vault wall, and felt the enormity of what she was doing press against her from every direction. She was opening a door that a woman had sealed decades ago, a woman who had spent her life ensuring that this moment would arrive only when the right person stood on this shore. Clara did not know if she was the right person. She only knew that she was the person who was here, and that sometimes that had to be enough. She moved to the fourth bolt and the fifth, her hands numb now beneath the cloth wrapping, her shoulders burning with a heat that had nothing to do with the weather. The sun moved across the sky, and the shadows shifted around the vault like the hands of a clock measuring time in a language older than ours. She thought of every door she had ever opened in her life. The apartment door that stuck unless you lifted it. The motel room doors with their electronic locks and their smell of disinfectant. The door of the sedan that carried everything she owned. None of those doors had required this much effort, and none of them had promised what this one promised, which was the answer to a question that a dead woman had spent 40 years refusing to ask anyone but her granddaughter. Lily arrived from school on the bus that stopped at the end of the access road, and Clara heard her daughter's voice calling from the cabin before she saw her appear at the water's edge, eyes wide, mouth open, staring at the structure that had emerged from the lake like something from a dream. The child stood perfectly still for a long moment, taking in the vault, the tools, her mother kneeling in the mud with wrapped hands and a breaker bar, and a landscape of exposed lake bed that stretched around them like the floor of a world that had been hiding beneath their feet. She did not ask permission. She walked down the bank and sat on a rock near the vault's wall and watched Clara work, her backpack still on, her school shoes sinking slowly into the mud. Her presence changed something in Clara's body, a loosening of the muscles across her back, a steadying of the breath that had been ragged for hours. She was not alone in this. She had never been alone in this, because Lily had been part of the equation from the moment the letter arrived. The reason Clara had come here, the reason she had stayed, the reason she was kneeling in the mud fighting corroded bolts with torn hands and a determination that no one in Harlan would have believed if they had seen it. Lily asked what it was. Clara said she did not know yet. It was the most honest answer she had given anyone since the letter had arrived in her mailbox, and it felt like relief. The last bolt gave way just before sunset. The metal plate shifted in its frame with a groan that seemed to come from the earth itself, a deep, resonant sound that traveled through the water and the mud and the air and settled into Clara's bones. She braced her feet against the base of the wall and pulled, and the plate swung outward with a reluctance that suggested it had been designed to open only from the outside, only by someone who knew it was there. Behind it was darkness, complete and absolute, carrying the scent of dry air and old metal and something else, something sweet and faintly chemical that Clara could not identify. She turned on the flashlight she had brought and aimed it into the opening. The beam cut through the darkness and struck the far wall, illuminating a space that was larger than the exterior had suggested. The vault extended backward into the bedrock, its ceiling supported by steel beams that showed no sign of rust or decay. The floor was dry, impossibly dry, considering that it had been surrounded by water for longer than Clara had been alive. The air inside tasted different from any air she had ever breathed, clean and mineral and ancient, as though it had been sealed away from the world so long that it had forgotten what sunlight smelled like. She took one step inside, and then another, her boots leaving prints in a fine layer of dust that no foot had disturbed in decades. The flashlight beam shook in her hand, not from cold or weakness, but from the tremor that runs through a body when it understands, at a cellular level, that the world has just rearranged itself around it. She thought, absurdly, of the motel room she had cleaned. Hundreds of them, thousands of them, each one stripped and scrubbed and made ready for someone else's temporary life. She had entered rooms in darkness before, her hand finding the light switch from memory, her body moving through the motions of labor without requiring her mind's participation. But she had never entered a room like this. She had never stepped across a threshold that separated everything she had been from everything she was about to become. The vault was not a room. It was a sentence that had been written decades before she was born, and she was only now arriving at the period. And on that floor, arranged in rows that spoke of organization and intent, were objects that made the flashlight beam shake in Clara's hand. Wooden crates, dozens of them, stacked 3 high and stretching from wall to wall. Metal boxes with latches and handles, the kind used for military storage or industrial transport. Canvas bags, thick and heavy, their shapes suggesting contents that were dense and uniform. And in the center of the vault, on a raised platform made of the same reinforced concrete as the walls, was a collection of items that did not belong in any category Clara could name. Gold bars, not the small decorative ingots sold in gift shops, but industrial-sized bars, each one roughly the size of a building brick, their surfaces dull with age, but unmistakably, undeniably gold. They were stacked in neat columns, 6 bars high, and the columns filled the platform from edge to edge. Clara stepped inside the vault and felt the temperature change, the air cooler and drier than anything she had experienced on the property. She moved the flashlight slowly across the room, counting as she went. The crates nearest the door had markings stamped on their sides, numbers and abbreviations that she did not recognize but that carried the look of official documentation. She set the flashlight on the nearest crate and tried the latch. It opened with surprising ease, the metal still functioning despite the years. Inside, packed in straw that had turned the color of old paper, were smaller bars of gold, each one stamped with a weight and a purity mark that Clara could read even in the dim light. 99.7%. 12 for kilograms. She ran her thumb across the stamp and felt the indentation press into her skin. The metal was cool but not cold, as though the vault had maintained a temperature that existed outside the seasons, a permanent autumn that neither froze nor thawed. She lifted the bar and held it in both hands, feeling the density of it settle into her palms like something alive. It was heavier than it looked, heavier than reason suggested, as though the weight of it carried not just mass, but the accumulated years of silence and patience and solitary work that had kept it hidden here. She set it back in the straw and closed the crate, her fingers leaving marks in the dust that would be the first new fingerprints the vault had received in decades. She opened a second crate and found the same. A third held something different, flat leather cases that contained, when she unzipped one with fingers that could barely grip, a collection of gold coins so old that the faces on them had worn to smooth ovals. She picked one up and felt its weight, the particular heaviness of gold that cannot be mistaken for anything else, and held it to the flashlight. The coin was not American. The script on its edge was in a language she could not read, and the date, barely visible, appeared to be from the 19th century. She stepped back from the crate and looked at the vault as a whole, trying to comprehend the scale of what she was seeing. The gold bars on the platform alone represented a weight she could not calculate and a value she could not imagine. The crates, if they all contained similar contents, multiplied that figure by a number that her mind refused to process. The canvas bags, still unopened, might hold anything. And in the far corner, partially hidden by the largest stack of crates, she could see the edge of something that looked like a safe, a freestanding steel safe with a combination dial and a handle that gleamed even in the uneven light. Clara sat down on the floor of the vault, her back against the cool concrete wall, and felt the flashlight slip from her fingers. It rolled to a stop against a crate, its beam pointing at the ceiling, and in the reflected light, she could see the entire room laid out before her like a map of someone else's lifetime of accumulation. She thought of the cabin with its leaking roof and warped floors. She thought of the apartment she had left behind, with its rattling vent and peeling walls. She thought of the motel room she had scrubbed and the boxes she had packed and the soup she had eaten at the diner counter while strangers pitied her. And she thought of Miriam Kovac, a woman who had lived alone on this shore for 40 years, sleeping in a cabin not much better than the one Claire now occupied, sitting on a fortune that could have bought her anything in the world, but choosing instead to wait, to watch, to record, and to trust that someone worthy would eventually stand where Clara was standing now. She picked up the flashlight and rose to her feet. Outside, the last light of the day was fading over the diminished lake, its surface now barely covering the lowest point of the basin. Lily was sitting on the porch of the cabin, drawing in the last of the sunlight, her pencil moving with the same quiet certainty that Clara had come to recognize as the child's way of processing a world that changed too often and too fast. Clara walked out of the vault and into the evening air, the smell of water and mud and new growth filling her lungs like a promise. She did not call anyone that night. She did not take photographs or make lists or calculate values. She sat on the porch beside her daughter and watched the sky darken over a lake that had finally given up the secret had been keeping since before either of them was born. And for the first time since she had opened the letter in her kitchen, Clara Dun Moore did not feel afraid. The next morning brought clarity the way mornings sometimes do, not by answering questions, but by making them feel less urgent. Clara woke on the cabin floor beside Lily, the wood stove cold, the air sharp and still. She dressed before the child stirred and walked down to the vault in the early light, her breath forming small clouds that dissolved into the pink-gray sky. The lake had dropped another 6 inches overnight. The vault now stood almost entirely exposed, its concrete walls dark with moisture, its outline as precise and deliberate as the day it had been built. Water still pooled around its base, but the doorway was clear, and when Clara stepped inside with the flashlight, the room looked exactly as she had left it. The crates, the bars, the coins, the safe in the corner. None of it had vanished in the night. None of it had revealed itself to be a dream manufactured by exhaustion and desperation. It was real. It was here, and it was hers. She began to inventory the contents with the same methodical patience she had watched Miriam demonstrate through the journal. She counted crates, 47 in total, arranged in 6 rows of varying height. She opened them one by one, recording the contents on a pad of paper she had brought from the cabin. The majority held gold bars of the same size and purity as the first one she had found, each stamped with markings that she photographed with her phone, the battery already low and the signal non-existent. 12 crates contained coins, sorted by type and stored in leather cases that had preserved them with remarkable effectiveness. The coins spanned nationalities and eras. She recognized British sovereigns and what she thought might be French Napoleons, but others bore inscriptions and scripts she had never seen and faces she could not identify. The canvas bags, when she finally opened them, contained raw gold, nuggets and flakes and rough pieces that looked as though they had been pulled directly from the earth without refinement. They were heavier than anything their size should have been, and when she poured handful into her palm, the weight of it pressed into her skin like a statement of fact. This was not decorative gold or symbolic gold. This was the physical reality of wealth extracted from the ground and stored with the intention of permanence. The safe in the corner resisted her for 2 days. She tried combinations based on dates from the journal, on numbers she found etched into the concrete pad outside, on the sequence of water levels that Miriam had recorded in her earliest entries. On the second evening, with Lily asleep in the cabin and the generator humming outside the vault to power the single work light Clara had rigged from the ceiling, she tried the date of her own birth. The tumblers clicked into place with a sound that traveled through the metal and into her fingers like an electric current. She pulled the handle, and the door swung open on hinges that moved as smoothly as though they had been oiled that morning. Inside the safe were documents. Not gold, not coins, not the physical wealth that filled the rest of the vault, but papers. Stacks of them, organized in folders that had been labeled in Miriam's hand. Mining surveys conducted in 1923 by a geological firm whose name Clara did not recognize. Assay reports dating back to the 1930s that confirmed the presence of a gold-bearing quartz vein beneath the valley floor, with estimated yields that made Clara read the numbers 3 times before accepting them. Correspondence between Miriam and a geologist at the University of Minnesota, conducted over a span of 15 years, in which the scientist expressed increasing astonishment at the data Miriam was sending and urged her repeatedly to allow a formal survey of the site. There was also a letter addressed to Clara. It was sealed in an envelope that bore no postmark, written in Miriam's hand, and it was the last thing Clara opened. She sat on the floor of the vault with the letter in her lap and the work light casting hard shadows across the crates, and she read words that had been written by a woman who knew she was dying and who had chosen, in the final weeks of her life, to explain herself to a granddaughter she had never been allowed to meet. The letter was not long. It did not apologize for the years of silence, because Miriam had not been the one who chose it. It did not explain the estrangement with Clara's mother, because some wounds do not have explanations, only histories. What it said, in language that was simple and direct, was that the vault and everything in it belonged to Clara now. That the gold had been accumulated over nearly a century, first by the original miners who had excavated the deposit in secret, then by Miriam herself, who had discovered the vault during a drought year and had spent the rest of her life cataloging, protecting, and adding to its contents through small-scale recovery operations she conducted alone during low-water seasons. The letter said that Miriam's best estimate of the vault's total value, based on the assay reports and the current price of gold at the time of writing, was approximately $240 million. Clara read the number and felt nothing. Not joy, not shock, not the dramatic surge of emotion that stories like this were supposed to produce. She felt only a vast, still silence, as though the number had created a space inside her that was too large to fill with any single feeling. She sat with the letter in her hands and listened to the hum of the generator and the distant sound of water still draining through the pipes, and she understood that her life had just split into two halves. Everything before this moment and everything after. The divide was absolute, and there was no going back across it. She folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope. Then she stood, turned off the work light, and walked out of the vault into a night so clear that the stars seemed to hang just above the treetops. The lake was barely a lake anymore. It was a shallow pool at the center of a wide, dark basin, its surface reflecting the sky with a stillness that made the whole landscape look like a photograph of itself. Clara stood at the water's edge and breathed in the cold air and felt the earth solid beneath her feet, the same earth that had held this secret through winters and thaws and decades of dismissal, waiting for someone who would not walk away. She thought of the diner counter and the man who had called her grandmother crazy. She thought of the post office clerk and the raised eyebrows. She thought of Margaret's careful questions and the warehouse women's satellite images of white emptiness. She thought of every person who had looked at this land and seen nothing, because they had never thought to look beneath what was visible. And she thought of Lily, asleep in the cabin, who had called it a storybook house on the day they arrived, and who had been closer to the truth than anyone. Clara did not know yet how to convert a vault full of gold into a life. She did not know how to navigate the legal, financial, and logistical maze that would follow this discovery. She did not know how to protect what she had found from the attention that would inevitably come. But she knew that the woman who had cleaned motel rooms and packed boxes and measured her life in bills and deadlines was standing on ground worth more than every building in the town that had pitted her. And she knew that the first thing she would do in the morning was call the one person whose expertise could confirm what the journal and the assay reports and the letter already told her. Because the vault needed a witness, and Clara needed someone to tell her that she was not dreaming. The call went out the next morning from the parking lot of the gas station in Harlan, the only place within 40 minutes of the property where Clara's phone could hold a signal long enough to complete a conversation. She sat in her car with the engine running and the heater pushing warm air against the windshield while she dialed the number she had found in Miriam's correspondence. The geologist at the University of Minnesota, who had spent 15 years exchanging letters with a woman he had never met about a deposit he had never seen. His name was Dr. Arthur Finn, and when Clara explained who she was and why she was calling, the silence on the other end of the line lasted long enough for her to check whether the call had dropped. He said he had been waiting for this phone call for over a decade. He said it without drama. the way a man might say he had been expecting rain after watching clouds build on the horizon. He told Clara that Miriam had written to him in her final year, warning him that the lake was approaching a critical level and that the person who inherited the property might need guidance. He said he had prepared for the possibility that the call would never come, and that he was grateful it had. He asked Clara 3 questions. Was the vault intact? Were the contents undisturbed? And did she have any idea what she was sitting on? Clara answered yes. Yes, and that she was beginning to understand. He said he would drive up the following day. Dr. Finn arrived in a vehicle that looked as though it had been designed for terrain far worse than the road to Clara's property. A mud-spattered SUV with geological survey equipment strapped to the roof rack and a back seat filled with cases that clinked softly when the truck hit the ruts in the access road. He was older than Clara had expected, perhaps 70, with a frame that had been shaped by decades of field work and a face that showed no surprise when he saw the drained lake and the vault standing exposed in the center of the basin like a monument to someone's extraordinary patience. He stood at the water's edge for a long time before speaking, his eyes moving from the vault to the cabin to the shed and back again, as though he were reading a story that had been written across the landscape in a language only he and Miriam had shared. He told Clara that Miriam had first contacted him 23 years earlier, sending a package to his university office that contained 3 sediment samples and a handwritten analysis that was, in his professional opinion, more rigorous than most graduate theses he had supervised. He said he had initially dismissed her as an amateur, a hobbyist with too much time and not enough peer review. It had taken him 6 months and 3 independent laboratory confirmations to accept that the woman living alone beside a frozen lake in rural Minnesota had identified a gold deposit that the entire mining industry had missed. He said that realization had humbled him in ways he was still processing, and that he considered Miriam Kovac one of the most remarkable scientists he had never met in person. They entered the vault together. Clara watched his face as the flashlight beam swept across the crates and the bars and the platforms stacked with gold. His expression did not change the way she had expected it to. There was no gasp, no widening of the eyes, no theatrical display of astonishment. Instead, his features settled into a look she recognized from the journal, a look of confirmation. He had believed Miriam's data. He had trusted her analysis across 23 years of correspondence and 3 independent lab results, and the slow, patient accumulation of evidence. The vault was not a surprise. It was a vindication. He moved through the space with the careful deliberation of someone accustomed to examining things that mattered. He picked up a gold bar and turned it in his hands, studying the stamp, feeling the weight, holding it to the light. He opened crates and examined coins with a loupe he produced from his jacket pocket, his breath steady, his hands sure. He spent 20 minutes with the documents in the safe, reading the assay reports with an attention that made Clara feel as though she were watching someone reunite with a correspondent they had known only through letters. When he finished, he sat on one of the crates and looked at Clara with an expression that carried the weight of everything he had just confirmed. He told her that the gold bars alone, based on a preliminary count and assuming standard purity, were worth approximately $180 million at current market prices. The coins, depending on their rarity and provenance, could add another 30 to 50 million. The raw gold in the canvas bags would require a saying, but his estimate, based on weight and visible quality, placed it in the range of 10 to 15 million. And the deposit itself, the vein of gold-bearing quartz that still lay beneath the bedrock under the drained lake, represented a potential yield that he was not prepared to estimate without a full geological survey, but that could exceed the value of everything already extracted. Clara asked him to repeat the numbers. He did, slowly, and then he told her something she had not expected. He said that the historical documents in the safe would likely attract as much attention as the gold itself. The mining surveys from 1923 were records of an operation that had never been registered with the state, conducted during a period when northern Minnesota was the center of a gold rush that most historians believed had produced nothing of significance. The existence of a successful, secret mining operation from that era, complete with documentation and physical evidence, would rewrite a chapter of the state's history. Museums, universities, and historical societies would compete for access. The story of the vault beneath the lake was not only a financial event, it was a cultural one. He recommended that Clara contact a specific law firm in Minneapolis that specialized in mineral rights and estate law, and an auction house with experience in historical gold and numismatic collections. He offered to serve as the independent geological consultant for the authentication process, a role he said Miriam had anticipated in her final letters, and one he considered a professional obligation as much as a personal one. He also warned her, gently but directly, that the moment this discovery became public, her life would change in ways that were difficult to predict and impossible to reverse. He said she should prepare herself, and more importantly, she should prepare her daughter. Clara drove him back to the gas station where he had cell service and watched him make 3 phone calls in rapid succession, each one conducted in the calm, precise language of a scientist reporting a finding that would not be diminished by understatement. She sat in her car and listened to the muffled sound of his voice through the closed windows and felt the strange, dislocating sensation of watching her own life pivot around a single point while the world continued as though nothing had happened. A truck passed on the highway. A dog barked in someone's yard. The woman at the gas station came out to check the price on the sign. Everything was ordinary except the knowledge that Clara carried, which made the ordinary feel like a disguise. The authentication process took 3 weeks and involved more people than Clara had spoken to in the previous 3 years combined. The law firm sent 2 attorneys who arrived in a rental car that looked out of place on the gravel road, and who spent their first hour on the property simply staring at the vault with expressions that oscillated between professional composure and undisguised wonder. They photographed everything, cataloged every crate, weighed every bar, and recorded every marking with a thoroughness that made Clara feel as though her property were being translated into a language she did not speak. They reviewed the deed, the will, the inheritance documents, and the geological surveys, and they confirmed what Miriam's letter had stated. The vault and everything in it belonged to Clara. There were no competing claims, no liens, no encumbrances. The property had been the Kovac family for over a century, and the mineral rights had never been separated from the surface rights. Whatever lay beneath the land, above the water or below it, was hers. The auction house sent a specialist in historical gold who arrived with a portable assay kit and a reference library that filled 2 suitcases. He spent 4 days in the vault, emerging only to eat and to make calls on the satellite phone he had brought because, as he explained to Clara with the practiced enthusiasm of someone who had spent his career waiting for exactly this moment, there was no cell coverage at the site, and the findings could not wait. His preliminary appraisal confirmed Dr. Finn's estimates and exceeded them. Several of the coin collections contained pieces that were not merely valuable, but singular. One case held a set of gold coins minted during the California gold rush that had never appeared in any known auction record. Another contained European pieces dating to the 18th century whose provenance, if verified, would make them among the most significant numismatic discoveries in recent history. The specialist told Clara, with a controlled excitement that he could not entirely suppress, that the coin collection alone might fetch over $60 million at auction, and that the historical significance of the find would drive the prices even higher. The news broke not because Clara released it, but because secrets the size of drained lakes do not stay hidden in small towns. The farmer downstream had mentioned the unusual water flow to a county engineer who had come to inspect a culvert. The engineer had driven past Clara's property and noticed that the lake, which had been a feature of county maps for as long as anyone could remember, was essentially gone. He reported it to the county office, which sent an inspector, who arrived on the same day as the auction house specialist, and found himself standing at the edge of an empty basin, looking at a concrete vault surrounded by people in suits carrying equipment he had never seen before. The inspector stood at the rim of the basin for a long time, his clipboard hanging at his side, his mouth slightly open. He had been sent to investigate a possible environmental violation, the unauthorized drainage of a natural water feature. What he found instead was a scene that belonged in a documentary, not in a county report. The vault's door stood open, its steel plate catching the afternoon light. Figures moved in and out of the structure, carrying instruments and notepads, and a woman he did not recognize sat on an overturned crate near the entrance, watching the proceedings with the calm attentiveness of someone who had been waiting for this moment longer than anyone around her understood. He approached her and asked if she was the property owner. Clara said she was. He asked what was inside the vault. Clara told him he was welcome to look for himself. He did, and when he came back out, the clipboard was shaking in his hands, and his voice had lost the official tone it had carried when he arrived. He asked if she knew what she had. Clara said she was beginning to. Within 48 hours, the story had traveled from the county office to the regional newspaper to a wire service that distributed it to outlets across the state and beyond. The headline that most people would remember was simple and direct. Woman inherits frozen lake, drains it, finds fortune worth over $200 million. The details varied by outlet, but the core of the story was the same. A single mother with nothing had been given a piece of land that everyone said was worthless, and beneath the water that no one had thought to remove was a vault containing gold that had been hidden for nearly a century. The narrative was irresistible because it followed the oldest pattern in storytelling. The overlooked, the dismissed, the underestimated, and then the revelation that changed everything. Television crews arrived before Clara was ready for them, their vans navigating the access road with a recklessness that left ruts deep enough to pool with water. They set up cameras at the edge of the basin and filmed the vault from every angle, their reporters delivering breathless summaries that simplified the story into something bright and consumable. Clara watched from the cabin porch as her property became a backdrop for a narrative she had not written and could not control. She gave one interview, brief and careful, in which she described her grandmother's work with a respect that the reporters seemed to find surprising, as though they had expected gratitude to be directed at luck rather than at a woman who had spent 40 years doing science in a shed. The first calls came from journalists, then from investors, then from mining companies, real estate developers, television producers, and a category of people Clara could only describe as opportunists whose specific intentions were unclear but whose interest was intense. The law firm handled most of them, filtering the legitimate from the predatory with an efficiency that Clara found both reassuring and slightly terrifying. She had gone from a woman who could not afford to replace her car's tires to a woman who required a legal team to manage the volume of people who wanted her attention. The contrast was not lost on her. 6 months earlier, she had stood in a warehouse packing boxes into cardboard containers for other people's lives. Now people in suits flew to Minnesota to stand in the mud at the edge of her property and ask permission to enter a vault that held more gold than most banks. The town of Harlan absorbed the news the way small towns absorb anything that challenges their understanding of themselves, slowly, unevenly, and with a mixture of pride and disbelief that settled differently on every person who heard it. The woman at the diner, who had spoken so freely about Miriam Kovac's strangeness, went quiet for several days before approaching Clara with an apology that was sincere enough to accept and awkward enough to remember. She said she had not meant any harm by her comments. She said she had not known. Clara told her that nobody had known, and that the not knowing was the point. Miriam had hidden the gold beneath a lake that the entire world had dismissed precisely, because dismissal was the best protection she could offer. The man at the end of the bar, who had called Miriam crazy and pitted whoever inherited her land, did not approach Clara directly. She heard through the feed store that he had told someone he always knew there was something off about that property, a revision of history so transparent that it would have been funny if Clara had been in a mood to laugh. She was not. She was too busy learning the difference between wealth as an idea and wealth as a daily reality, a distinction that turned out to be far more complicated than she had ever imagined. The man at the feed store, the one who had told Clara to save her money for a bus ticket, was the hardest to read. She encountered him 2 weeks after the news broke, standing in the same spot behind the same counter, ringing up the same kinds of purchases as though the world had not shifted beneath his feet. He did not mention the gold. He did not mention the vault or the lake or the headline that had made the property he had dismissed into the most famous piece of land in the state. He simply rang up her items, told her the total, and waited for her to pay. But his hands were not as steady as before, and his eyes did not quite meet hers. And when she picked up her bag, he said something so quiet she almost missed it. He said he was glad she had not taken his advice about the bus ticket. Clara looked at him for a moment, long enough to see that the words had cost him something, and then she nodded and walked out. It was not forgiveness, exactly, and it was not revenge. It was the acknowledgement that they had both been standing in the same feed store all along, and that only one of them had known what lay beneath the surface of the world they shared. The principal at the school, Gunderson, stopped Clara in the hallway one morning when she came to pick up Lily for a dental appointment. He did not mention the gold directly, but he mentioned the school's aging boiler system and the windows that let in drafts and a library that had not received new books in 4 years. He mentioned these things with the careful casualness of a man who had learned that need speaks more persuasively than asking. Clara listened and said she would think about it. She did not tell him that she had already thought about it, that she had been thinking about it since the day he had implied her daughter might struggle to adjust, and that the thinking had resolved itself into something that felt less like charity and more like justice. The strangest consequence of the discovery was how it changed Clara's relationship with money itself. For years, money had been the enemy, the force that dictated where she lived, what she ate, how much sleep she could afford to lose. It had been the barrier between Lily and stability, the wall that Clara had thrown herself against every day without ever making a crack in its surface. Now, suddenly, the wall was gone, and the landscape behind it was so vast and so unfamiliar that she sometimes felt more disoriented by its absence than she had ever felt by its presence. She would sit at the kitchen table in the renovated cabin, the same table where she had once spread documents by the light of a single lamp, and catch herself adding numbers in her head, calculating costs and balances that no longer needed calculating. The habit of scarcity did not vanish with the arrival of wealth. It lingered in her muscles and her breath, a phantom limb that still ached where the poverty had been. The post office clerk brought Clara her mail with a new attentiveness, sorting the growing stack of correspondence into categories that she explained with a helpfulness that had not been present 6 weeks earlier. Clara thanked her each time and carried the letters to the car without comment, aware that the dynamic between them had shifted in a way that could not be undone by politeness alone. She did not blame the clerk or the diner woman or any of the people whose attitudes had changed overnight. They were responding to new information the same way she was. The difference was that she had lived inside the uncertainty while they had watched from a distance, and that gap in experience would always be there, quiet and uncrossable, no matter how many kind words filled the air above it. Margaret called on a Thursday evening, her voice carrying the particular tightness that Clara had come to associate with conversations her sister found difficult. She said she had seen the news. She said she was happy for Clara. She said she was sorry if her earlier comments had been discouraging. The words were carefully chosen, each one placed with the precision of someone building a bridge they were not sure would hold. Clara listened and accepted the apology with a grace she did not entirely feel. She understood that Margaret had spoken from a place of genuine concern, that her skepticism had been rooted in the same protective instinct that had driven her to offer a spare bedroom and gentle warnings. But she also understood that the spare bedroom had been offered with reluctance, and that the warnings had carried an undertone of judgment that Clara would not forget, even if she chose not to mention it. She told Margaret about the vault and the gold and the letter from Miriam, and she heard her sister's breathing change on the other end of the line, the slow intake that precedes either tears or calculation. Margaret asked how much. Clara told her. The silence that followed was the longest of their conversation, and when Margaret finally spoke again, her voice had the quality of someone who has just realized that the world is not shaped the way they believed it to be. She said she did not know what to say. Clara said that was fine. She said there would be time to say things later, when the shock had settled and the numbers had become real. She did not say that the numbers had not yet become real for her either, because admitting that felt like a vulnerability she was not ready to share. 2 days after Margaret's call, Clara drove to the cemetery where her mother was buried. It was a 6-hour drive, back across the state line, and into the town where she had grown up, a place she had not visited since the funeral. The cemetery was small and untended, its stones tilting at angles that suggested the ground beneath them was as restless as the people it held. She found her mother's marker by memory, a flat granite rectangle that gave nothing but a name and 2 dates and the silence between them. Clara knelt in the grass and placed her hands on the stone and spoke to her mother for the first time in years. She told her about the letter and the property and the lake. She told her about the cabin and the shed and the journal filled with handwriting that was small and precise and full of a patience Clara was only beginning to understand. She told her about the vault and the gold and the number that still felt like it belonged in someone else's story. And then she told her mother the thing she had come here to say, which was not about money or land or even about Miriam. It was about the silence. The years of questions deflected and doors closed and conversations ended before they could begin. Clara told her mother that she understood now that the silence had not been about anger or cruelty. It had been about pain. Whatever had passed between her mother and Miriam, whatever wound had severed them so completely that an entire generation grew up not knowing its own grandmother, it had been a wound that her mother could not revisit without reopening. And so she had sealed it, the way Miriam had sealed the vault, with the hope that time would do what forgiveness could not. Clara did not cry. She had spent too many years rationing her tears the way she rationed everything else, and the habit held even here in the one place where no one was watching. But she pressed her palm flat against the stone and felt the sun's warmth stored in the granite, and she told her mother that she forgave her, not for the silence itself, but for the fear that had made it necessary. She said that Miriam had forgiven her too, because the letter in the vault had been written not with bitterness, but with love, the kind of love that survives even when the people who carry it cannot find their way back to each other. She said that the estrangement was over now, not because it had been resolved, but because it had been inherited and Clara had chosen to spend it differently than it had been saved. She drove back to Minnesota that evening with the windows down and the radio off and the road stretching ahead of her like a sentence that had finally found its verb. The cemetery receded in the rearview mirror, and with it the last weight that the discovery had not yet lifted. She was not returning as the woman who had left. She was returning as someone who understood that the gold beneath the lake was not the most valuable thing Miriam had hidden there. The most valuable thing was the chance to close a circle that had been open for too long, a circle that began with a grandmother standing at the water's edge and ended with a granddaughter driving home to stand in the same place. The weeks that followed were a blur of legal proceedings, appraisals, and decisions that Clara had never been trained to make. The law firm established a trust to hold the assets, a structure designed to protect the wealth from the various forces that would inevitably attempt to claim or diminish it. The geological survey of the lake bed confirmed the presence of the quartz vein and estimated its potential yield at figures that made the vault's contents look like a down payment. Mining rights negotiations began with 3 companies, each offering terms that the attorneys reviewed with the attention Clara had once reserved for coupon calculations. She sold a portion of the gold through the auction house in a private sale that generated enough immediate capital to address every financial concern she had carried since Lily was born. The debts were paid. The car was replaced. The cabin was not demolished, but renovated. Its walls insulated, its roof straightened, its plumbing modernized with the kind of care that preserved the character of the original structure while making it safe and warm. Clara insisted on keeping the wood stove, not because she needed it, but because the smell of burning wood in the evening had become part of what the cabin meant to her, a reminder of the first nights when warmth was not guaranteed and every flame was an act of faith. Lily's school fees were secured through a fund that would carry her through college and beyond. Clara set up a scholarship in Miriam's name at the University of Minnesota's Geology Department, a gesture that Dr. Finn accepted with the quiet emotion of a man who understood that science and legacy are sometimes the same thing. She donated a selection of the historical coins to a museum that agreed to display them alongside Miriam's journal and the blueprints from the shed, creating an exhibit that told the story not of gold, but of a woman who had spent 40 years listening to a lake that no one else thought was worth hearing. The property itself was transformed, but not in the way the developers had hoped. Clara declined every offer to sell, every proposal to build, every suggestion that the land would be better used as a resort or a mining operation or a tourist attraction. She kept the 40 acres intact, maintaining the drain basin as an open space where the vault stood as a permanent structure, its doors sealed now, but its existence acknowledged. She planted the slopes of the basin with native grasses and wildflowers, restoring the valley to something closer to what it had been before the water came. And she built a small house on the ridge above the cabin, a house with windows that looked out over the land in every direction and that filled with light in the mornings in a way that made Lily say it felt like living inside the sun. The change in Lily was the thing Clara noticed most and spoke about least. The child who had slept with a pillow over her ear to block the rattling vent now slept in a room with windows that opened on a silence, so complete it had its own texture. She no longer watched her mother's face at the grocery store, searching for the tightening around the eyes that meant something had to go back on the shelf. She no longer folded her clothes with the careful precision of someone who knew that replacements were not coming. She drew more than she ever had, filling notebooks with images of the valley, the vault, the cabin, the birch trees, and always in the corner of every picture, a woman standing at the edge of the water. She had claimed Miriam as her own, the way children claim characters from stories they love, and the claiming had given her something that Clara recognized because she had lacked it herself at that age. It was the sense of belonging to a history that mattered, of being part of a chain that stretched backward into time and forward into possibility. Lily had a grandmother now, even if the grandmother existed only in a journal and a photograph and the walls of a vault that had waited beneath a frozen lake for her to arrive. Clara watched her daughter grow into the space that the discovery had opened, and she understood that this was the truest measure of what had changed. The gold could be counted and appraised and locked in vaults of its own. The land could be surveyed and planted and maintained. But the transformation of a child who had learned to expect nothing into a child who was beginning to believe that the world might hold something for her that could not be measured by any instrument yet invented. It was worth more than the vault and everything in it, and Clara carried that knowledge the way she carried the photograph, close to her body, always within reach. She did not become a different person. She did not buy things she did not need or surround herself with people who had not been there before the gold was found. She continued to drive to Harlan for groceries, though she no longer ordered the cheapest item on the menu. She still cleaned, not motel rooms, but her own house because the rhythm of the work calmed her and because she had learned that there is dignity in labor that does not depend on whether you can afford to hire someone else. She read Miriam's journal in the evenings, not for information anymore, but for company, following the careful handwriting through seasons and water levels and quiet observations about the birds that visited the shore and the way the ice sounded different each year as the lake slowly changed. She funded the renovation of the Harlan School, not with a check delivered through lawyers, but by driving to the principal's office on a Tuesday morning and sitting in the same plastic chair where she had filled out Lily's enrollment forms 2 months earlier. The principal listened to Clara's offer with the stunned composure of a man who had spent 20 years writing grant applications for new windows and was now being told that the entire building could be modernized. Clara asked only one thing in return, that the school library be named after Miriam Kovac, and that a copy of the journal be kept there for any student who wanted to understand what patience and observation could accomplish. The principal agreed before she had finished the sentence. She established a fund for single mothers in the county, administered through a local nonprofit that she helped create with an initial endowment that the director described, in a voice that cracked slightly around the edges, as transformative. The fund covered rent, child care, job training, and emergency expenses, the same categories of need that Clara had navigated alone for years without a safety net. She did not put her name on it. She called it the Kovac Family Fund because the money had come from a woman who had never been given the chance to help her own daughter and who had found, in the end, a way to help daughters she would never know. The man at the drainage business who had sold her the pump came to the property one afternoon, unannounced, carrying a bottle of something wrapped in brown paper. He stood on the porch of a new house and told Clara that he had sold pumps for 30 years and that no one had ever used one to drain a lake and find a fortune underneath. He said he wanted to tell people about it, but that no one would believe him. Clara invited him in for coffee and showed him the photograph of Miriam standing beside the pump, and he held it for a long time, turning it over to read the words on the back, and then he laughed. Not the laugh of someone who finds something funny, but the laugh of someone who has just understood something he should have seen all along. He said he wished he had asked more questions when she came into his shop. Clara said the best questions are the ones you ask after you already know the answer, and he laughed again, and this time it was real. The relationship with Harlan settled into something that resembled normalcy, though it would never be the same as what existed before. People spoke to her with a warmth that was genuine but complicated, the warmth of those who know they misjudged and are trying to make amends without admitting the full extent of their error. Clara accepted it because bitterness was a luxury she had never been able to afford, and because she understood that the people who had doubted her had also doubted themselves. And that doubt, in a place where the land demanded everything and returned so little, was not cruelty. It was survival. One evening in late summer, Clara sat on the porch of the new house with Lily beside her, watching the sun drop behind the tree line that bordered the old lake basin. The valley was green now, the grasses she had planted already tall enough to sway in a breeze, and the vault stood at the center like a stone in a meadow, its concrete walls catching the last of the light. Lily was drawing again, her pencil moving in the slow, careful strokes that had not changed despite everything else that had. She was drawing the valley, not as it was, but as she imagined it had looked before the water came, a wide green bowl cradled by trees with a river running through it and a woman standing at the edge, looking down. There were moments, even now, when the old weight returned. Not the weight of poverty, which had been lifted so completely that its absence sometimes felt like a missing limb, but the weight of understanding what poverty had cost her. She thought of the years she had spent counting coins on the kitchen counter while Lily slept, the careful rationing of food and heat and hope that had defined their existence. She thought of the mornings she had driven to the motel in the dark, her body already tired before the work began, and the evenings she had driven to the warehouse, her hands raw from cleaning supplies, her mind too exhausted to think about anything beyond the next shift. Those years had not been wasted. They had built something in her that the gold could not replace, and that she would not trade even if she could. They had built a knowledge of what it means to persist when persistence is all you have, and that knowledge was now part of the foundation she stood on, as solid as the concrete walls of the vault. She thought about the women at the warehouse, the ones who had packed boxes beside her in fluorescent silence, their hands moving in rhythms that matched her own. She had sent letters to each of them, not through the law firm, but in her own hand, offering positions in a small business she was starting in Harlan, a distribution center for locally made goods that would provide the steady hours and predictable pay that she knew they needed. 3 of them had accepted. 2 had called to thank her with voices that carried the particular thickness of gratitude that comes from being seen by someone who remembers what it feels like to be invisible. The others had not responded, and Clara understood that silence too, because there had been times in her own life when an offer of help had felt more like a reminder of need than a promise of relief. She thought about Deb, the manager at the motel, who had never been kind, but who had also never been dishonest, and who had given Clara shifts when others would have cut them. She had driven back to the motel on a weekday afternoon and found Deb counting towels in the laundry room with the same clipped efficiency she had always shown. Clara had offered to buy the motel, not to close it or gut it, but to renovate it and keep it running under Deb's management with wages that reflected the work rather than the market. Deb had looked at her for a long moment. The counting paused, her expression unreadable, and then she had nodded once and returned to the towels. It was the closest thing to an emotional exchange they had ever shared, and Clara valued it precisely because it was real. Dr. Finn visited the property once more before the end of summer, bringing with him a young graduate student who was writing a thesis on glacial mineral deposits and who looked at the vault with the same expression Clara imagined Miriam would have worn if she had lived to see her work completed. They walked the valley together, the three of them, with Finn pointing out features of the landscape that Clara had learned to read through the journal, the contours of the old riverbed, the exposed quartz veins that glittered in the sunlight, the places where the bedrock broke through the soil like the spine of the land itself. He told Clara that the geological survey had confirmed Miriam's theory in its entirety. The deposit was one of the most significant undiscovered gold reserves in the upper Midwest, and its existence beneath a glacial lake had protected it from the same industrial extraction that had stripped similar deposits elsewhere. He said that Miriam's decision to wait, to study rather than exploit, had preserved something that most scientists would never have had the discipline to leave alone. He said it quietly, standing at the edge of the valley with the wind moving through the grass, and Clara heard in his voice the same reverence she felt every time she opened the journal. The graduate student asked Clara what she planned to do with the deposit. Clara said she had not decided, and that she was in no hurry to decide. She said her grandmother had waited 40 years, and that a few more months of patience would not diminish what lay beneath the ground. The student nodded, perhaps not fully understanding, and Finn smiled in a way that suggested he understood completely. Clara asked who the woman was. Lily said it was the grandmother they had never met. She said she had drawn her from the photograph, the one Clara had found in the wooden box beside the wood stove on the day they arrived. Clara looked at the drawing and saw that Lily had captured something the photograph had only hinted at, not the features or the posture, but the patience. The absolute, unshakable patience of a woman who had stood on this shore for 40 years, watching and waiting and believing that the water would go and that someone would come. Clara thought about all the mornings she had woken in the apartment with a rattling vent, adding numbers that never balanced. She thought about the motel rooms and the warehouse shifts and the soup at the diner counter. She thought about the drive across 3 states with everything she owned in the trunk and a child in the back seat who did not ask questions because she had already learned that answers were unreliable. She thought about the mud that had tried to swallow her shoes and the cabin that had tried to freeze them out and the lake that had looked like nothing, like white emptiness, like the surface of the moon. And she thought about Miriam, who had known all along what lay beneath that surface and who had chosen not to rush, not to sell, not to panic, but to wait for the right person to arrive. The right person had not been a geologist or a miner or a developer. It had been a woman with nothing left to lose and a daughter who needed a home. Miriam had understood that desperation, properly directed, becomes determination, and that determination, given enough time and enough trust, becomes discovery. Clara reached into her pocket and pulled out the photograph. She had carried it with her every day since finding it, a talisman against the doubt that still visited her in quiet moments. She held it up beside Lily's drawing and compared the two. The photograph showed a woman standing at the edge of a lake with her hand on a pump. The drawing showed the same woman standing at the edge of a valley with the water gone and the green coming back. Between the two images lay a lifetime of waiting and a spring of revelation, and Clara understood now that they were not 2 separate pictures, but 2 halves of the same story. She set the photograph on the porch railing where the evening light could reach it, the same way she had once propped it against the window of the cabin. The breeze stirred the grasses in the valley below, and the last of the sun caught the concrete walls of the vault and turned them gold for a moment, just a moment, before the shadow came and the color faded and the ordinary dark of a summer evening settled over the land like a promise kept. Lily looked up from her drawing and asked if they could go down to the valley in the morning. Clara said yes. She said they could go down every morning if they wanted to, because the valley was theirs, and the morning was theirs, and the ground beneath their feet held more than anyone had ever thought to look for. She said that was the thing about places and people that the world calls worthless. They are only worthless until someone has the patience to see what they are hiding. And sometimes what they are hiding is everything. The night settled over the valley with the slow certainty of a season turning. Stars appeared in clusters above the tree line, the same stars that had watched over the lake when it was frozen and full, the same stars that had kept Miriam company through 40 years of solitary observation. Clara sat in the quiet and let the stillness hold her the way the land had held its secret, completely and without apology. She understood now that the inheritance had never been about the gold. The gold was a consequence, an outcome of decades of work performed by a woman who refused to let the world's indifference determine the value of what she had found. The real inheritance was the lesson embedded in every page of the journal, in every sample jar sealed with wax, in every pipe laid carefully into the mud along the lake bed. The lesson was that the things worth finding are always hidden beneath the things the world tells you to ignore. That patience is not passivity, but the most demanding form of action, and that the people who laugh at what they do not understand are not enemies. They are simply people who have not yet learned to look beneath the surface. Clara folded the photograph one last time and slipped it into the pocket of her jacket, where it would stay until the next morning, when she would carry it down to the valley and stand where Miriam had stood and feel the ground solid beneath her feet and know, with every part of herself, that she was home. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.